Polling places nationwide are poised to open doors in fewer than 24 hours now, as most Koreans prepare to cast their ballot for a new administration, which will enter the top office the very next day after voting ends at 8 p.m. on June 3rd. With more press perspective today. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Monday, June 2nd. I'm Min Sunhee. Election day is tomorrow, and today we touch upon the latest on the campaign front and more. For this, I have freelance journalist Raphael Rashid here in the studio with me. Raphael, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio with us. Steven, thank you so much for making time to be here live.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Raphael, we will start with you. So South Korea saw its second highest early voting last week at almost 35%. What's your take on this turnout rate?
Yeah, I think that this turnout rate, I think it goes to show the enthusiasm of the South Korean electorate engagement with this election. The 34.7% early turnout is indeed the second highest in South Korean presidential election history since early voting started. And I think this number is, I guess, particularly striking given the context of this election. After all, this isn't any usual election. This is a snap election that was triggered by an unprecedented constitutional crisis. So I think many see this election as a kind of judgment day, judgment election. And I think that enthusiasm was reflected in the early voting that we saw the other day. Also interesting was the regional dynamics at play. We saw the progressive strongholds of South Jeolla province in the southwest recording the highest early voting among all provinces in the country at 56%. Then we had North Jeolla province at 53%, Gwangju at 52%. Then we had Daegu, which is traditionally more conservative. They had the lowest at 25%. And I think that this maybe reflects both historical voting patterns, but perhaps also different attitudes towards the legitimacy of early voting, because many people do question whether or not early voting is susceptible to fraud or not. Of course, these claims have been debunked by Korean election officials and courts, but I think it was very interesting to see these kind of dynamics at play. But I guess overall, all eyes will be on tomorrow, and we will see whether or not we will have record-breaking turnout or not.
Right, and that being said, Steven, do you see this reality? The reality I'm talking about, of course, is the high voter turnout during early voting. Do you see that affecting the turnout tomorrow?
Well, I think we can only really speculate about what early voting means just because the data doesn't tell us anything about the voters' motivation. Like, it doesn't say why they are voting early. And I mean, I have a kind of sneaking suspicion that the high early voting rate is a kind of symptom of the world we now live in, where like everybody does everything on demand. You know, there's no real appointment viewing anymore. People watch TV shows when it's convenient for them, etc. You know, people order things online when it's convenient for them. I wonder if a large part of the motivation for early voting is you have this 2-day window during which you can vote, and the lines will be shorter. You can, you know, pick the time during it's a broader window, and it's maybe a little more convenient for some people. And also, you know, tomorrow is, you know, in South Korea, Election Day is a holiday, and so if you get your early voting out of the way, then that leaves you with this holiday on which you have the whole day to, you know, spend time with your family or your friends, and sort of be interrupted. I mean, when I initially saw the high turnout, I wondered if, like as Raphael alluded to, it's a symptom of high voter interest in this election. But then I learned that it was actually the second, if I'm not mistaken, the second highest all time after the election of 2022. And with the benefit of hindsight, it seems like this is a kind of higher stakes or potentially more, you know, some more electricity surrounding this election than there was with that one. I mean, I do think this is a very politically engaged country, and it's a country that's, you know, very densely populated. So, like, most people don't have to drive very far or like endure super long commutes. Voting is made convenient in a lot of places. Like there's a lot of voter stations, and most people are able to get out. And I do think that this is a a time when there's a lot of really pressing issues. So I do think voter turnout on the whole will be quite high. I think we might need a little bit more distance to conclude the like specific role that early voting plays in it.
Right. In the meantime, Raphael, there are some pundits who are calling this particular presidential election the grey election, as the number of voters in their 60s and 70s reportedly surpassed that of voters in their 20s and 30s. Do you see this reality as affecting the election outcome?
I think yes and no. I think this demographic does reshape Korea's electoral dynamics. As you mentioned, 60s and 70s outnumber those in their 20s and 30s. 60s and 70s represent 33%, whereas 20s and 30s represent 28%. Korean media are calling this silver pyoshim, or the kind of silver vote, or the grey election phenomenon. But I think this isn't just about aging, it's about fundamentally different lived experiences and political priorities. I guess to put this into perspective, South Korea has gone from having 10.36 million people over 60 in 2017, and now we have 14.7 million. So that's a 42% increase over the past 8 years. Meanwhile, the younger demographic, as we all know, is basically shrinking due to the plummeting birth rate situation. But I think just because we see a great number of people over the age of 60, I think does not necessarily mean that this is, for example, the conservative vote. Today's people in their 60s, they, of course, include those, the Sampalyuk, the 386 generation, those who were in their 30s in the 1980s, during the democratization movement of the country, born in the 1960s. So I think older voters have, they've lived through authoritarian times and democratic transition. So potentially they might be more susceptible or more sensitive towards Yoon's martial law attempt in December. But at the same time, I think they might also prioritize economic stability, security concerns, perhaps a little more so over traditional progressive agenda. So I think this creates a kind of interesting dynamics, especially for the candidate Lee Jae-myung, who is technically from the kind of liberal or progressive camp, but has been positioning himself more as a centrist, trying to appeal to voters on the right and saying that he's more on the right than the left. So I think that this grey kind of nature of the election will certainly play out in this election. And I guess we have yet to see tomorrow during the election whether Lee Jae-myung's popularity will be throughout all different generations or not.
Right. And aside from calling this particular election the grey election, pundits have also taken time to point out that the political polarization here in South Korea, Steven, appears more pronounced, if you will, between the two genders among first-time voters. What's your take on that?
Well, I don't know if I have a neat and tidy explanation for it. I would just start by saying that specifically the split that is observable now is young women tending to vote more for liberal or left-leaning parties and young men being quite conservative. And this is something that's happening really, I think, all over the world in a lot of industrialized societies. Like this phenomenon is observable in North America and the UK and various European countries. But it does seem like it's particularly pronounced in Korea. And so if you look at polling data, like Gallup has released some polling data on this that shows that specifically when you look at candidate Lee Jun-suk, and I don't remember the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but I attended a briefing recently where a researcher from Gallup pointed out that if you compare the incidence of support among young South Koreans for Lee Jun-suk, the rate by which men support him is something like, I think, 3 or 4 times what women do. So like his support is like very much skewed towards men. It's men who are quite in favor of him, and it's women who are not at all. And there's various reasons for this. I mean, I think that there is some frustration among South Korean men about having to serve in the military and having to, the job market is quite difficult, and certain political candidates have spoken to that, and they have treated the grievances among young men as being something that they say they will address. Why is it something when it comes to women's voting patterns? Like, is it something about the liberal parties that they find particularly appealing, or are they just kind of turned off by the messaging on the conservative side? I don't really know. But this is something that I think is playing a real role in this election and could also be a salient factor going forward. I would just say that in the absence of like a neat and tidy explanation for this, I think a task for the next South Korean president, whoever he may be, is to address these real kind of root cause sources of economic anxiety and try to spur growth and try to spur the creation of stable jobs. And I think if you can, without attempting to specifically address gender grievances, if you can address those kinds of very basic and fundamental economic matters, jobs, housing, education, and all the rest, then the hope is that you can see kind of the temperature go down in the battle of the genders that we've seen in South Korea in recent years.
Right, hopefully. Raphael, the political events here in South Korea over the past few months that have raised quite a bit of concern about a breeding ground for strong leader syndrome. Now, for the sake of our general audience, could you start by defining that term for us? And do you believe the national circumstances here in the country have given rise, indeed, to this particular syndrome?
Yeah, this strong leader syndrome, as you put it, it refers to this political phenomenon where societies, particularly those during times of crises or institutional weaknesses, maybe gravitate towards authoritarianism or authoritarian-style leaders who promise simple solutions, a quick fix solution to complex problems. It's usually the belief in a single person or single powerful figure who can transcend normal democratic processes and basically fix everything. Recent academic research on Korean politics identifies this phenomenon as part of a broader personalization of power, where political authority becomes concentrated in this one figure, this one individual leader, rather than institutions. I think the conditions in South Korea seem ripe for this kind of syndrome. Of course, we have experienced an unprecedented constitutional crisis under former President Yoon. But I think just because the country has maybe dealt with him and removed him from power, removed him as a figure, I don't think it means this phenomenon has necessarily disappeared or is gone for good. I think while Yoon's martial law attempt was swiftly rejected, the underlying conditions for the kind of syndrome, they still remain, and both candidates represent, I would say, versions of a strong leadership or strong leadership syndrome, even whether it's Lee Jae-myung or Kim Moon-soo. I think both are noted for their kind of personality, leadership. How can I say? Their followers tend to look at them as the leader, as opposed to looking at their politics. And I think that they have kind of personality cults around them on both sides of the equation. So I think the real question maybe isn't whether Korea will elect, say, a dictator in the future, but whether the next president will gradually erode democratic checks and balances while claiming to represent the people. Of course, I hope not, but we have yet to see what will happen, whoever becomes the president. So I guess the key test will be which political coalitions emerge, whether frustrated voters will align behind promises and decisive actions, or whether democratic resistance we've seen throughout the martial law crisis will translate into sustained institutional strengthening.
Right, of course, all after June 3rd, the election day then. Steven, local media outlets, those here in South Korea, they've also been making note of North Korea's silence with regard to South Korea's snap election. Now, in the past, the regime has taken it upon itself to deride our presidential contenders and their pledges. Do you suppose their silence is golden?
I don't know about golden, but I think it's indicative of a couple things. I would say, generally, I would say that North Korea has kind of lost interest in South Korea to an extent. I don't think they're all that keen on following what happens here because I don't think they see it as really affecting them all that much. I mean, 20 years ago, or even more recently than that, there was a lot more exchange between the two Koreas, and there just really isn't a whole lot of either economic or political interaction between them. So I don't think the leadership in Pyongyang is really looking at what's happening here and feeling as though they are downstream of South Korean politics. I don't think they feel like their prospects would change all that much. I think we saw under the previous time we had a liberal administration under Moon Jae-in, there was a ton of back and forth. There was a ton of, there were summits taking place in both countries and all kinds of things happening, and they kept running up against the red line of U.S. sanctions. So the administration of Moon Jae-in was not willing to engage in cooperative projects that would have violated international standards on those things. And so I think at that moment, North Korea kind of concluded that South Korea doesn't have all that much to offer them. They've turned their attention towards Russia, towards China, and I think that's their focus now. Another thing is I think North Korea used to really be able to play on public opinion in South Korea. They used to be able to divide public opinion because there was a kind of latent I don't know what the right word is, like affection, or there were more South Koreans who were kind of sympathetic to North Korea under previous elections. I think if you look at poll data, you'll see that young South Koreans generally don't feel longing or kinship with the North in the way that older South Koreans do, and I don't think that there's a ton of sympathy or of affection for the North, and so I think that North Korea does not look at South Korea anymore as somewhere where they have a kind of silent support or silent approval or anything like that. So those are the real two explanations I will point at. Number one, they don't feel as though they can affect opinion, and number two, they don't feel as though a change of administration in Seoul stands to impact them all that much. But we can also speculate as to what might they do in the subsequent few months. North Korea has this history of when there's a new administration in Seoul, they carry out some kind of provocation and they attempt to sort of gauge the new administration's reaction. If Lee Jae-myung is the winner, he comes from the same kind of progressive camp that Moon Jae-in did. Would he seek to reinitiate inter-Korean dialogue? I think he said something recently that he would attempt to restart the dialogue channel, a hotline that they used to have. So never a dull moment here on the peninsula. We'll see.
Right. And speaking of that, polling places here in South Korea will open doors in about 12 hours from now. Raphael, do you see any variables that may serve to perhaps sway swing voters as we count down the hours to election day?
If I can give two answers, short answer, I don't think so. I think before the polling blackout period, when we're not able to kind of publish any new polling data, I think we did see Lee Jae-myung was in the lead. Kim Moon-soo was behind by about 10 points in different pollings. And at the time, this is about a week ago, the big differences that we could have potentially seen were whether or not Kim Moon-soo would unify with another candidate, or whether someone will drop out, or whether a candidate is unable to suddenly run due to some serious issue. But basically, none of that has happened. So I think the short answer is I don't think there will be many changes. But of course, we never know. There's still 12 hours to go before people go to the polls tomorrow. And I think if we're going to look really, really into it in detail, I think there are two potential ways that may swing the vote. I think the young voters, I think we've seen, will young voters continue this energy, this enthusiasm that they've shown throughout the entire impeachment proceedings to to basically get rid of former President Yoon. I think young voters tend to support Lee Jae-myung, but I guess they could also be unpredictable. They might stay at home if they think the result is already decided, or they could go to the polls in mass if they feel energized by the kind of democratic moment or democratic movement. I think the other potential factor would be conservatives, whether they will show up or not to the polls. The People Power Party has been in relative disarray over the past month and a half, especially we didn't even know whether Kim Moon-soo would become the candidate or not, and there was all this kind of unification chaos. And I think this kind of official nominee internal fighting, I think, put off a lot of conservative voters who have been demoralized not only by the internal strife but also the martial law. And I've been going around the country talking to conservatives who feel that they don't necessarily have a party that may represent them. And so some people have told me that they might not actually vote on the day because they don't feel represented by the People Power Party and they don't want to vote for Lee Jae-myung. So what will happen to those conservative voters? Will they just, on the day, vote for the party that they've always voted for or not? I think that will be really interesting to see. We saw that Daegu had some very low early voting rates, but that doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. I think traditional conservative voters tend to just go on the day itself. We also know that the older electorate, they tend to be very disciplined, and even though they might not be excited, I think they cherish their vote and will go anyway on the day. So again, we'll have to see whether they decide, or at least conservatives decide, that we do not want Lee Jae-myung as president, therefore I have to vote for the other side. I guess one more thing is the weather matters. I think traditionally when it's warm and sunny, people typically tend to go out and maybe vote a little bit more. But I think it comes down to Lee does have a solid lead, but the elections aren't necessarily about, if you tell the pollster, I'm going to vote for this side or the other. I think it comes down to whether you stick to who you want to vote for and do end up voting on the day.
Right. Well, we'll find out, I suppose, after tomorrow then. Steven, what might be the focus of the foreign media coverage after the election as South Korea ushers in a new administration?
I'd say that foreign policy would be a big one, specifically how Lee plans to engage with the U.S. on this question of tariffs. I say that's for all foreign media. I think that's something that everybody will be watching closely. Whoever the next president is when there's the inauguration ceremony later this week, I think everybody will be watching for mentions of relations with the U.S., what they plan to do with the economy. And the kind of flips the other side of that spectrum is the China policy, because South Korea is in this really interesting situation of being a U.S. ally who also has a very important trading relationship and is a neighboring country of China, and like always having to balance these sometimes conflicting priorities. And then just domestically, there's the economy. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what. I just attended an event with Lee earlier today where he talked about measures to kind of revive the domestic economy, measures to put life into science and technology and industry and all these things. And he talked a lot about kind of the plight of regular people. Like he invoked some specific examples. He said he talks to taxi drivers who have a tough time earning even 50,000 won in a shift, and he talks to parents who feel as though mothers who want to stay at home and be with their children, but they feel like they need an income, so they have to be at work. And he's mentioned young people who are like the most credentialed generation in South Korean history. These people have been in educational institutes for many, many years, but they're entering the job market and they have a real tough road ahead of them. So there's any number of challenges, both in terms of how South Korea interacts with the outside world and how to address the concerns of people here at home. So whoever wins will be needing to get to work right away, I think.
Right, for sure. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Stephen, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Raphael, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Monday's edition of Press Perspective. We return same time on Wednesday with the foreign media coverage of the election result. Join us then.